we read a special Torah reading, and that Torah reading was called Hachodesh. And that Torah reading lines up for us, delineates for us the law of keeping Rosh Chodesh, counting the new moon. And specifically, that law is related to Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the first day of the month of Nisan. And specifically, that law is given so that Passover, so that Pesach, falls out always in the spring. Because if we did not have the law of Rosh Chodesh, that the law of Rosh Chodesh tells us that we have to count Rosh Chodesh, but also that Passover has to be in the spring. And so we have this idea that we follow the lunar calendar. It's the first mitzvah that's given to the Jewish people as a people. In fact, Rashi, when he opens up his commentary on the entire Torah, he asks the question about the words Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. He asks the question, why does the Torah start with the narrative of creation? The Torah is not a book of stories. It should start with the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people. And the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people is the Parsha Hachodesh, which is that we are a people that has to follow calendar predicated on the moon, and also that we have to adjust our calendar so that this Rosh Chodesh Nisan, always starts to take place in spring. So it's a double whammy. And it happens to be that tonight is Rosh Chodesh, right? So we are now hours away from Rosh Chodesh itself. And of course, that's not an accident, because a solar eclipse can only happen on a Rosh Chodesh, because the moon has to be lined up in such a fashion that it always begins at the birth of the moon. And so we have this great intersection that I found to be quite fascinating between the Torah reading of last week, which was a very special reading of Hachodesh, which is the first mitzvah of the Torah that's given specifically to the Jewish people. There are, of course, other mitzvot, for example, the mitzvah to have offspring, to have children. But the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people as a people is Hachodesh, is to have Rosh Chodesh, is to follow the lunar cycle, and is specifically to ensure that this Rosh Chodesh, the one that we're going to celebrate tonight and tomorrow, falls when it does. And here we have this solar eclipse that happens to be one that we can see, that happens right on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, right after we've read this Torah reading on Shabbat, and then during the week that we are reading this Torah portion of Tazria. So I'm going to make the connection between the Torah portion of Tazria and the solar eclipse. But before we do that, I want to dive in a little bit into this idea of a solar eclipse and what our sages have to say about the solar eclipse. But before we get into the solar eclipse itself, there's a fascinating medrash that is actually brought down in the Talmud. And the medrash is expounding on the idea that when we have in Genesis, we have in Bereshit, the description of the lights that were created as part of the natural order of creation of this planet, of our planet Earth, that the Torah initially describes these lights as Shnei Ma'orot Hagdolot, the two great luminaries. And so the Talmud asks the question, how is it that both the moon and the sun are called the two great luminaries, when in fact it is the sun that is the great luminary, and the moon, of course, is only a reflection of the sun? So this is a question that the Talmud asks, and it brings to answer it a very mystical medrash. That's the best we can say about this medrash. And in this medrash, the sun and the moon are having this conversation with God, as it were. And I want to share that with you because I think it will shed light into the later descriptions that we're going to have in the Talmud about eclipses, and specifically a solar eclipse, and then the descriptions and the commentaries that the rabbis will have on the Talmud regarding what they say about the eclipse. So let's get into this interesting medrash that talks about these two great lights to begin with. and why the Talmud is puzzled by this, that they're called two great lights. So first, in Genesis, we have this description of the two great lights. As I mentioned before, they are called Viyu Hamarot Barakia Shamayim Laha'ir ala Aretz Vayichein, and they shall serve as lights to shine in the sky. And it was so. And then the description, Vayatz Elikim Eshnei Hamaorot Hagdolim, and God made two great lights. And then after it calls them two great lights, it starts to delineate and say, this the big light, Hamaor Hagadol, Lememshelet Bayom, the big light will dominate the day, and the small light will dominate the night. So then the question is, why do you start off by calling it two great lights? Why didn't you say, Vayas Elokim Ma'or Gadol, Lemem Shalat Hayom, Ma'or Katan, Lemem Shalat Halayla. God made two lights, a small one and a big one. Why do you call them both great lights? That's the question that the Talmud has in Chulin. So let's go to the Talmud. And we'll go straight into the English for so that we can get into, so we can move this time-wise, we can cover the ground that I want to cover in this class. So we have here Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi. Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, he asked the question, what's this idea that it's called the Ma'or Tagdolot? And so Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi raises the contradiction between these two verses, and he asks, it's written that God made the two great lights. Then it explains, or it delves into the idea that no, actually there's a greater light and a lesser light. That only one was great. So Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi explains this fascinating medrash. And again, it's a mystical medrash. So we're going to understand it on a mystical level. And this is it. When God first created the sun and the moon, they were equally bright. Then the moon said before the Holy One, blessed be He, Master of the universe, is it possible for two kings to serve with one crown? In other words, who's the boss? One of us must be subservient to the other. God therefore said to her, to the moon, okay, if you think that someone has to be subservient, go and diminish yourself. So, so the moon says before God, Master of the universe, I said something correct. Just because I brought up a correct issue, I have to go diminish myself? Are you shooting like the messenger? So God said to her, as a compensation, go rule both during the day along with the sun and during the night. And so the moon says to the gods, what is the greatness of shining alongside the sun? What is the use of a candle in middle of the day? The candle of middle of the day is not needed. God said to her, go let the Jewish people count the days and years with you. This will be your greatness. So she says to him, but the Jewish people will count with the sun as well. As we know that we have to have Pesach in the spring, and therefore we have a leap year, as we did this year, where we added the month of Adar in order to compensate for the discrepancy between the lunar cycle, which is shorter than the solar cycle. As it is impossible that they will not count the seasons as it is written, and let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. So God says to her, to the moon, go, let the righteous men be named after you. Just as you are called the lesser, Hakatan, there will be Yaakov, Jacob, our forefather, Hakatan, Shmuel, for the prophet, Hakatan, David, King David is called Hakatan. And God saw that the moon was not comforted. So the Holy One, blessedly, he said, bring an atonement for me, since I diminished the moon. And this is what the Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says. What is different about the goat offering of the new moon, that is the carbon that was brought on Rosh Chodesh, that God said that this offering will be an atonement for me for having diminished the moon. So this is a very strange, if I could say so, it's a very strange type of it's a strange type of, a very, very mystical type of teaching in the Talmud. And there's a lot of discussion on this. What does this mean that, what does it mean that the God is having this conversation with the moon? I mean, we understand how the astrological universe works. There is a sun that warms the earth, and the moon reflects it at night. And what is this idea that it was diminished? What is this idea that the Jewish people are compared to the moon? What is this idea that God says, bring atonement for me? So every Rosh Chodesh in the temple, there was a korban chatas, there was a sin offering that was brought by the Jewish people, as it were, on behalf of God for having done this to the moon. So the moon is diminished for bringing an obvious truth to the world, as it were, and the Jewish people bring an offering on behalf of God. So the mystics say that this exchange in the Talmud represents the idea that in this universe, there is going to be always a level of pain, injustice, lack of clarity, suffering, that no matter how much tzedakah is given and how much movements are created to repair the social justice, and it's definitely, as Jews, we're given this job of tikkun olam, that there is an inherent flaw in life on earth, which is life on earth is not always going to be fair, and that this medrash about the moon complaining is a reflection of that truth, that life on this earth is not always going to be just, it's not always going to be fair. And we see who are called the small ones in this medrash that the Talmud quotes. So it's not a regular medrash that's kept for the books of the medrash, but rather something that the Talmud brings down. We see that King David is called small. Solomon is the Samuel is called small. Jacob is called small. These are all the great lights of the Jewish people, so that the Jewish people are very much connected with the smallness of the moon. The Jewish people are very much connected with the injustice of the universe. In other words, and we know this all too well, that sometimes we look at the world and we say, but don't you get it? This is not right. And yet, this section of Talmud is telling us that there is an inherent flaw in the very universe, that there is imperfection. And for this, God says, you know what? I acknowledge this. Bring an offering on my behalf. When? On Rosh Chodesh. As God is almost saying that I have sinned. And the korban that's brought on Rosh Chodesh on behalf of God, as it were, is called a korban chatas. The word chatas, cursory translation would be sin. But the etymology of chatas is tes aleph, which means lack. So there is a lack in this world. God acknowledges that the way the world has been created is that there's going to be the moon and there's going to be the sun. There's going to be the great lights that really shine, and there's going to be the hidden truths. And this is, in the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, this is expounded upon in great detail. And we don't have time to get there, but I want to just set the stage for why the rabbis would take a particular interest in eclipse, because they don't just see the eclipse as an astronomical phenomenon, which it is, but rather also as a euphemism for something more than what we see in front of our eyes. So let's get into where the Talmud actually discusses the eclipse. And what's fascinating about the Talmud's discussion of both a lunar and solar eclipse. So the lunar eclipse would be when the moon is hidden by the light of the sun. And of course, the solar eclipse is when the sun is being hidden by the moon. What's very fascinating is that the Talmud uses the word for eclipse. It says loke, that kashemesh loke or kalevanan loke. What does loke mean? Loke means beaten or hit, smacked. So the word for eclipse that the Talmud uses is beaten or smacked or hit, so that the sun today is being hit by the moon. The sun is being hurt by the moon, as it were. The moon is going to take away some of the sun's light for a brief moment in time. So let's get into the Talmud, where the Talmud in Sukkah discusses this. And then what I would like to do is talk also about in halacha. What are the ramifications in terms of how do we see this in terms of any blessings that we make? And then finally, I want to go into some of the mystical interpretations on the Talmud itself, but even a rationalization of what the Talmud says, and then tie it in with the Torah portion of Tazria, which I found to be really fascinating, where it's underscoring a certain truth about our universe that we may not be so aware of at first glance. And so we're going to take it to that level. So let me just share with you the Talmud in Sukkot. So make sure my Talmud in Sukkot is lined up here. Okay, so here we go. Good question. So Debbie asked the question, is there significance that the moon is female? I would say yes. In the liturgy of moon and sun, the sun is the giver of energy and the moon is the receptacle. And in Jewish mysticism, the giver is always masculine and the receptacle is always feminine, even if it's not necessarily a man or a woman, but it is a feminine thing to receive called nukva, and it is a masculine thing to give. So yes, there is something to be said about the moon covering the sun that we can get into a little bit later. But let me first go into the section of this portion of Talmud, which actually discusses the solar. So here this is from Talmud and Sukkos. It says, Tanya Rabbi Meir Aimer. Rabbi Meir teaches this. Kol zman shema'aris loikin. Whenever the lights are hit, Biman ra l'feinehem shel Yisrael, it's a bad omen for the enemies of the Jewish people. And then it says something very fascinating here. Mipnei shelomodin b'makaisehem, because the Jewish people are knowledgeable in beatings. Okay, isn't this apropos for our time? So Rabbi Meir says when the heavenly lights, i.e. the sun and the moon, are eclipsed, it's a bad omen for the enemies of the Jewish people. And then the Talmud goes on to say this is a euphemism for the Jewish people because the Jewish people are experienced in their beatings. That means we know what it means to be beat. And this is what the Talmud says. I found it so fascinating. Based on past experience, they assume that any calamity that afflicts the world is directed at them. And then the Gemara suggests a parable, which the Gemara says, Misha Roga Lilkais, the Chol Yaim, V'Yaim Hudayeg. And he says, someone who is always hit gets worried when things are hit. And the parable that the Gemara suggests is this is similar to a teacher who comes to the school with a strap in his hand. Who worries? The child who is accustomed to be beaten each and every day is the one who worries. So here what the Talmud is telling us is that the eclipse is actually not a bad omen for the Jewish people, but it's a bad omen for the enemies of the Jewish people. But it's actually the Jewish people that will become frightened, or that even here he says that the Jewish people become the euphemism for the beating, because the Jewish people are used to seeing negative things happen to them. So when something unusual like this happens, they're concerned for themselves. And what the Talmud is talking about here, the idea that the child who worries about being beaten is the one who is a child that has been beaten. The Talmud is actually like allowing us to understand a psychological phenomenon, which is that, if a person is someone who has experienced something, they're going to see the potential of that strap. So for example, if a child never got hurt, a strap means nothing to them. But for the Jewish people, that strap means something to us. So when we see the rabbi said, when we see an eclipse, we get nervous. But let's see what they say about the eclipse itself. Let's continue on with this discussion. So this is now they make the Talmud is going to make a distinction between the sun and the moon. So when there is a solar eclipse, there's a distinction that the sages in the Talmud will make. Tanu Rabbanan, Bisman shehacham alaykim. The rabbis say, when the sun is eclipsed, it's a bad omen for the other nations. When the moon is eclipsed, it's a bad omen for the enemies of the Jewish people. Yes, so this is due to the fact that the Jewish people calculate their calendar primarily based on the moon, and the other nations calculate based on the sun. When the sun is eclipsed in the east, it's a bad omen for the residents of the east. When it's eclipsed in the west, it's a bad omen for the residents of the west. When it's eclipsed in the middle of the sky, it's a bad omen for the entire world. Now, and then it goes on to talk about the different warnings that it can have. But what's interesting is, let's just take a moment to unpack this. What the Talmud is making two important statements here. One is that the Jewish people worry more about these things than other people because we're used to calamities, or we're worried about this happening. However, since the Jewish people are compared to the moon, when there is a solar eclipse, essentially what's happening is that the moon is blocking the sun. And so that it is, if you want to go into omens, it is an omen that those who are connected to the moon are going to be, at least for a brief moment, blocking the power of the sun, and therefore it's a good omen for the Jewish people. This is what the Talmud tells us. But the Talmud then goes on to give reasons for the solar eclipse happening. And this is where it gets very interesting. There's a discussion that happens in the writings of our sages where they question the Talmud. First of all, we know that the Jewish people are above and beyond Mazal. But they ask the question, how can you say, for example, that the solar eclipse happens for a reason, or it means something, when the solar eclipse and the lunar eclipse are natural phenomena, so natural that we know we can predict it with accuracy to know when the next one's going to happen, where it's going to happen. The more aware we are of the universe, the more we will be able to know those things. So what is this idea that it's connected to some kind of reason? And I want to just briefly go into the reasons that the Talmud gives for the solar eclipse, and then to ask the question, do we make a blessing on it? Okay, because it applies for us today. So let's go into the reasons that the Talmud gives us, because the discussion here is very long. Okay, the Talmud tells us something that we know as Jews. So says Hashem, learn not the way of the nations, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the nations are dismayed at them. In other words, don't worry, don't take it as an omen. The nations will be dismayed, but the Jewish people will not be dismayed because we don't follow these omens. But then the Talmud goes and says the following, and this is what I want to unpack with you, and then just delve into more of any type of discussions that we have on this idea of the eclipse. The Talmud, Tanu Rabbanan b'shvil arba dvarim chamaloka. The sages taught that on account of 4 matters, the sun is eclipsed. On the account of Av Beis Din, here they call it the president of the court. It's the Av Beis Din, the head of the Beit Din. Shemet ve'eno nisvot k'halacha. It's account of the president of the court who dies and is not eulogized appropriately. So the eclipse is a type of eulogy by heaven. Or al naira hamirasa shetzaka be'ir ve'en mashiala, about a betrothed young woman who screamed in the city that she was being raped, and there was no one to rescue her. Va'al mishkav zachar, on account of homosexuality. Va'al shnei achin shenishbach daman ke'echad, on account of two brothers who were killed together. And then it talks about why the other heavenly lights would be eclipsed, and it would be about forgers, false testimony, and so on and so forth. Okay, and with this, I would like to take you to the commentaries. One of the great commentaries on this section of Talmud is brought to us by the Maharal of Prague. So the Maharal of Prague, of course, is this great rabbi from the 1500s that it becomes the emerging light. His name is Rabbeinu Loi, and he lives in, of course, Prague. He is a great scientist, astronomer, halachist, a mystical teacher, one of the great lights of the Jewish people in the diaspora, in the diaspora in Europe. And the Maharal of Prague is known to be this great mind. He wrote many books. His greatness was so known that there is a statue that was erected in his honor that is still there in Prague today, in the old city of Prague. And he is still venerated as one of the great people who lived in Prague by the Gentile population in Prague. So the Maharal of Prague he has a scientific mind, and he's a rationalist, like in the path of Maimonides. The Maharal of Prague asks the question, and his commentary, unfortunately, is not translated. It's online, at least. It's not translated. There is a book that translates his stuff, but it's not translated. But I'm going to share with you what he says and paraphrase because it's very long. But essentially, the Maharal of Prague asks the question. He says, what is this notion that the Talmud gives a reason for the eclipse? That he gives a reason for the eclipse for a rabbi who was a decipher of halacha that wasn't properly eulogized, a girl who was raped, homosexuality, or the idea that there's things are not done properly. So the question the Maharal asks is, how can the Talmud make such a claim when we understand that the solar eclipse is a result of a natural phenomenon that can be predicted to when it will happen again? So even, I guess, at the time of the Maharal, the scientists of the time already understood that the solar eclipse was a natural phenomenon of when what happens essentially in a solar eclipse is that the moon, which gets in between the Earth and the sun, is aligned perfectly to meet the sun on the degree that the sun is facing the Earth at that time. And because the moon is 400 times bigger than the sun, because the sun is 400 times bigger than the moon, really the moon should not be able to block the sun, but because the sun is 400 times further from the moon, that is why it could happen that during a new moon, every so often, there will be this perfect alignment that the moon will come in front of the sun during the day and block out the sun because everything is just perfectly aligned for that to happen. And so he says that this is clearly an astrological phenomenon. And so how can the Talmud predicate it on behavior? And he says, what is the notion of the behavior? And he unpacks it in his great teachings called Ba'or HaGolah. He unpacks it, and we have here the Maharal. I'm not going to go into it verbatim because of time, but just to say that he goes into a long discussion of this. Let me just pull out the Maharal. Here we go. So this is his commentary called Ba'or HaGolah, right here. And he is bringing up this teaching that we just learned, that there are four reasons for the the solar eclipse, and he goes into this long discussion, which again, time does not allow for us to learn word for word. But in this long discussion, what he does point out is how each of these 4 reasons reflect a reality of lacking. So he says that essentially it is not a precise reason, but rather it's a euphemistic reason. And he says as follows, that the sun, without the sun, there is no earth. The sun is the greatest star for Earth. And the sun is basically makes Earth possible. So whenever the sun is blocked, it's a huge moment because it's telling us that there's a lack of energy coming to Earth. And as the Talmud uses the word that the sun is being hit by the moon, there's a lack of energy. And he says that this lack of energy reflects an existential lack in the universe. And that existential lack in the universe is a certain fault in the fact that in this universe, in this world, there is an imbalance where evil can reign supreme. And he says that these 4 examples that are given by the Talmud would be examples of lack, of a tremendous lack, and that's why they're used to explain this great lack. So he says, for example, of Beit Din, someone who is a decisor of halacha, is a great light. And so therefore, when that great light has been blocked, then it creates a reality of lack. The same is true for a woman who is raped and no one comes to save her. That it's a certain a lack in a society that this could happen. And so so I'm just going to discuss this, that there's a lack in the society that this can happen. And he says, furthermore, the same is true for homosexuality, where there's the lack of the woman. So there's not a completion of male and female. He created them. There is the lack of the woman in that picture. So there is, again, a lack. And then 2 brothers being killed on the same day is poetically so unjust that, again, it shows a lack. And so what the Maharal goes on to explain is that when the fact that there is a phenomenon of the solar eclipse reflects that this universe, that the world that we live in is a world that is inherently faulty, that is inherently unjust, that terrible things can happen to people. There could be an imbalance in the universe. And that's all reflected in those 4 examples that the Talmud gives about the solar eclipse. But his underlying principle is, he says, it's not to take and say that literally these are the 4 reasons that the solar eclipse happens, but rather the solar eclipse is a reflection of a society or a world, not even a society, of a universe that there is a lack. And this is the terminology that the Maharal uses, he consistently uses in this very long dissection of the Talmud piece. He consistently uses the words hisaron, he uses the words lack. And he said basically there's almost like a breaking of the order. The sun should not be blocked in the middle of the day. It's almost like an astrological defect. That's what the Maharal is saying. And he's saying an astrological defects come to this universe because the universe is a universe full of defects. And in this universe, a woman could get raped and nobody cares. I found this specific example of the Talmud, that a woman can get raped and nobody cares, just so apropos in terms of the fact that the voices of the women who were sexually assaulted in Israel are just not being listened to. And so what the Maharal is saying is that it's not a direct cause, because clearly we know when the next solar eclipse will happen. but rather it is almost a poetic reflection of a world that is not perfect, that there is a lack in this world. And that lack is borne out through this cosmic reality. We're in the middle of the day, and today is a sunny day, so we'll be able to be aware of it. There is something broken. And it's very interesting that our sages have given us reasons to give blessings for everything. So we say a blessing on lightning. We say a blessing on thunder. We say a blessing on all types of natural phenomena. But we do not say a blessing on an eclipse. So I want to show you the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the Shulchan Aruch that talks about the different blessings, and in here we do not have any mention of eclipse. And then there's the commentaries of why this is so. So we have here, this is the code of Jewish law. So if you see a comment, right? Also, if you experience an earthquake, so if you experience an earthquake, lightning, thunder, or even a very strong storm, you say the bracha of Oseh Ma'aseh Bereishis. So the blessing would be Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam, Oseh Ma'aseh Bereishis. You have created from the beginning. So we recognize that this is a natural phenomenon. It's part of our universe. And if you feel that this is particularly powerful, you say, Shekocho u'varosei mali olam. You make the blessing of your strength and might fill the world. So whenever there is a comet, lightning, thunder, earthquakes, we say the blessing either Oseh Ma'aseh Bereishit, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam, Oseh Ma'aseh Bereishit, or Shekocho u'gvurato mali olam. And I do remember as a child, and then here there's more. This is if you see great mountains, there's a blessing to say Oseh Hayam Hagadol. If you see a great we're seeing great mountains, oceans, and something that's very awe-inspiring, you can make these blessings. When you see a rainbow, we make a blessing, right? We say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam Zocher Habrit Neman Bevrito V'Kayim Amamaro. That blessed are you, God our Lord, He who remembers the covenant, who's faithful to his covenant and fulfills his word, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of brachot that we can make when we see natural phenomena that are unusual or that are awe-inspiring. But when it comes to an eclipse, we do not make a blessing. And the reason we don't make a blessing, our commentators say, is because the eclipse reflects a certain negative, a lack in the world, where even it's true that, let's say, an earthquake is a fault line, so you could say, and it's probably much more damaging than an eclipse, but nevertheless, the rabbis did not associate that specifically with an inherent flaw in the universe. And because the Talmud tells us that eclipses happen because things are not right in this world, the eclipse is always associated with a lack, something is missing. Now, that being said, a solar eclipse is an interesting phenomenon, because what's happening is that this great light, remember this medrash that I was sharing with you at the onset of this class, which was the great lights that the Talmud talks about, that the great lights, the sun and the moon, and the diminution of the moon, and the moon is like this punished and doesn't give its own light, and it only is around at night. You have suddenly, for a few moments, sometimes a minute or two, here it's going to be partially for 2 hours and fully for a minute or so, that the moon actually is going to take over the sun. And it says that when Mashiach will come, when the world will be all right, when people will know the difference between right and wrong, then the sun and the moon will no longer be two unequal lights, but they will be equal. Now, what does that mean? It's hard to understand from our universe um, what it actually means. Um, you know, um, you know. So let me just. What does it actually mean? So it's a euphemism again for that initial Talmudic teaching that this universe, the way God created our universe is predicated on the fact that it's not perfect, that there's going to be an imbalance and there's going to be injustice. And people will call day night, night day. Yet when there is a partial or a momentary eclipse by the moon to the sun, what you have essentially is you have during that time, during this eclipse, you have a brief diminution of the sun and the moon is ascendant. And that is almost like it's a poetic justice. It's like it's repairing the pain of the moon, that the moon is always only seen at night, and now the moon is turning the day into night. And so it's the ascendant power of the moon. And Debbie asked earlier, is there any connection to the moon and being feminine? And yes, there is a tremendous connection between the, the lunar cycle and the moon and femininity. Because we know that throughout history, women were called the fairer sex, but they were usually the weaker and the one in need of protection and often abused or at least manipulated. And it wasn't a fair game between men and women. The woman was under the auspices of the control of the man, and depending on the man that she was with, she either lived an okay, good life or not. So that, and of course, all of society was predicated on the fact that anything that is feminine is not venerated. So being caring and being out of the limelight and being self-sacrificing and being empathetic and valuing connection takes second place to fame, fortune, power, and that's a masculine energy. And so it's true that throughout our history as a human species, the feminine was like the moon in diminution compared to the sun and needing the sun to exist. And I'll explain the bracha on the eclipse in a minute. And needing the sun to exist, and yet here we were told that because of that, the woman is compared to the moon, and not to mention also that the woman's very natural biological cycle in her reproductive years is very much like the moon, where there's a preparing of greatness, of fertility, and then there's the diminution. A woman's hormonal levels literally rise and fall during her reproductive years, like the moon waxes and wanes. It's a very similar trajectory. And so there is a connection between the moon and femininity for many, many reasons. And the Jewish people are also seen in that light as the feminine dimension, where the Jewish people are coming to teach caring and concern and compassion. And when it comes to absolute power or numbers, we're always outnumbered, we're always outpowered. And so it says that when the world will be all right, when there will be the coming of Mashiach and the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, and when the world will be balanced, it says, Isha tisovev gever, that the woman will be higher or more important than the man, that she will be the crown of his head. And there will be a recognition of the femininity and the feminine energy as being superior to the male energy, which is fascinating. So there is a huge connection between all of these. Even Shabbat itself, and Shabbat is a euphemism for the world to come, is a taste of that feminine energy being supreme, because on Shabbat, you don't have to create and build and destroy and fight and do wars or be powerful. All you have to be is who you are. You have to just be in a state of reception of the divine. So there is definitely that connection. And so what the Maharal is teaching us, and when I saw this teaching of the Maharal, I was blown away, because there are many people who come to try to explain the Talmud, and they give good reasons, but what the Maharal is saying is, don't see the forest for the tree here. There's a greater idea, and the greater idea is that in a world that is imperfect, in a world that is lacking, that's going to be reflected also in the astronomical reality of that world, so that things will seem broken. There will be a lack. And that's because the world itself is predicated on this lack. And so that's on one level. And the other level is that when the moon comes out of her shell, as it were, and comes and confronts the sun, it's almost like a challenge of this small moon, this gentle moon, this reflective moon that says, you know what, sun, you are but a creation, and if God wills it, I can block you. And it's a very powerful moment where you see that this otherwise gentle sun is becoming a force that the sun has to reckon with. Sorry, the moon becomes a force that the sun has to reckon with. So there's a greater idea, which is both that there is a corrective measure that can happen through the moon, which is a euphemism for what will happen when the world is corrected. This great diminution of the moon, that God himself says, I have to bring atonement for the fact that there is injustice in the universe. And then you have the notion that this is a world that there's brokenness in this world, that a woman could be raped and nobody could care. I found that the timing of all this was just very interesting for me. And then we have this connection to the Torah portion of Tazria, and this is a very fascinating connection. The Torah portion of Tazria Mitzora starts off, and I'm just going to pour up to the Torah portion. It's a very fascinating Torah portion. It's a Torah portion that discusses essentially all the levels, or the many levels of what we call Tuma and Tara, very poorly translated as purity and impurity. And the Rebbe asks the question, how is it that a Torah portion that is all about the different levels of Tuma, which is so-called impurity, is called Tazria. Tazria means to give seed, to give birth. And it's predicated on the fact that the Torah reading this week opens up with the words, Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Lemor, Daber el Bnei Yisrael, Lemor, Isha ki Tazria, if a woman conceives or gives seed and gives birth, and after she gives birth, how long she is not allowed to come to bring an offering because she is in a state of a menstrual flow. And the Rebbe asked the question, and I'll just give you in a nutshell what the rest of the Torah portion is. The Rebbe asked the question, how is it that a Torah portion that is full of laws about Tuma starts with the idea of conceiving in seed? It seems to be a misnomer for that Torah portion. And the answer is that if you look at the Torah portion of this week, the Torah portion of this week will discuss the different times that a person cannot come to the temple. So, a woman after childbirth, a person when they are in a state of tzarat, when they're afflicted with leprosy, or if a person has something called zav or zava, which is a seminal emission or a bodily emission that is coming from a lack of health. In all these cases, a person has to first purify themselves before coming into the temple. So all of this, the person who is a zav, and the person who is a mitzora, and the woman who would give birth, they're all in a state of natural, biological imperfection. It's interesting that Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, when he, who's this great sage from the 1800s, when he talks about, when he gives the description or the translation for the word tameh, which everyone translates as impure, which is not the correct translation, but it's the closest we get to English. He calls it blocked or a lack. That tameh is a lack, And tahor is clarity, is translucent, it's transparent. So we have, Rabbi Adin Steinzel says that there are two stages in life. There are two stages in the universe. All that is good and that's transparent and that is viable, and then all that is blocking and all that is not perfect and all that is a lack of vitality. And this Torah portion is all about those cases where there is a lack of vitality. And all lack of vitality comes back to the same source, which is, why is it that a woman who gives birth becomes impure? She shouldn't become impure. She should be very pure after she gives birth. But there's a lack of vitality because there's an absence, there's a blockage or an absence after her child leaves her womb. So that the mystics talk about this idea of a blockage. And I was looking at the Torah portion of Tazria, and our sages tell us that all these blockages are a part of the natural phenomenon that the universe is not a perfect universe. Because there is sin in this universe, there is evil, there is darkness, there is lack of transparency, there is cruelty. So all of these are brought out in what we call purity and impurity. And I thought that the intersection between this Torah portion of Tazria, which talks about these blockages that are inherent to the universe, is coming at a time where we're going to see a blockage that is inherent to the universe. It's part and parcel of the imperfection of the solar system. And I saw something very interesting on a scientific page, and I don't have it here, from NASA, I think it is, that with time, these solar eclipses will become more and more rare, actually. They're going to happen less frequently. And I thought that was very beautiful. It's very poetic. It's almost like the world is correcting itself, and the world will become corrected. And of course, when the world will be corrected, then the values of the feminine, which is represented in the moon, which is represented also in the Jewish people, will become more appreciated by the universe. So I thought it's very, very powerful. But it is to say that when we see something like this happen, we do have to take stock. And there was the Rebbe, actually, he addresses the idea that the Maharal addresses about the solar eclipse. And the Rebbe, being scientifically minded, he was an engineer. The Rebbe I'm going to answer all the questions soon because I want to get through this thought for those people who have to leave by 12. The Rebbe, being scientifically minded, asked the same question that the Maharal asks. And he says, we know that the solar eclipse is part and parcel of the design of the universe, that there's an imperfection in the universe. The Maharal highlights that imperfection as reflecting an imperfection in our world and everything that is wrong with our world. And the Rebbe says, so what is the meaning for us when we see a solar eclipse or when we're aware of it? And the Rebbe says, it's true that the solar eclipse is predicated on something that's much greater than our actions, but that the fact that we become aware of this solar eclipse, or that we're even able to see it. So, for example, the Rebbe gives is that on a very cloudy day, solar eclipse or not, you're not going to see it. But if you are able to see it, or you're aware of it, so today, through scientific reasoning and through tremendous the gift of communication, all of us can see it. Everyone will be able to see the solar eclipse on TV, on computers, if we don't see it out of our window. But the Rebbe says that the fact that you're able to see it means that there's something that you have to observe and say, what am I going to learn from this experience? And so I thought that tied in so beautifully what the Maharal says. It's like, okay, Monday, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the day that the Jewish people count as the first day of their month of the year, the day that they have the first mitzvah given to them, after a half a year of very difficult times within Israel and without. We have this phenomenon that happens to be that we'll be able to see, whether we choose to see it or not. This very sunny day is going to make it very obvious. It's very sunny in Montreal right now. It's like perfectly blue skies. That we have to take a lesson, and we have to be introspective. What is the meaning of this? So when we take those two ideas together, the idea of the Maharal that there is Oh, too bad. Montreal is so it's so sunny. The sky is the bluest I've seen it in a long time. That there is that we have to take a lesson to the fact that yes, there is an injustice in the world, and that injustice is reflected even in the astronomical goings on, and that the rabbis understood that there's an inherent flaw in the universe, and when we pay attention to this, and when it comes to our attention, rather, what we do is that hold on just 1 second, ladies, just one second, I'll be right back. I have just 1 second. Sorry for that. The unexpected doorbell ring when I'm the only one home. So what we have here is the ability to introspect on the fact that our universe is not perfect. We're shown the sign, and then we're able to, first of all, take comfort in the same way that God tries to comfort the moon at the that when the moon is a reality that is only going to be a reflection, small and diminished compared to the sun, God tries to comfort the moon, and he acknowledges through the carbon of Rosh Chodesh that yes, indeed, there is a flaw in this world, and I apologize for making the world with a flaw. And then, of course, the idea that we can take from this is two things: is that there is a flaw in the world, and we shouldn't become, I guess, despondent when we see a tremendous level of injustice that we do experience. I personally feel that the world is in a state of terrible injustice and denial. I found it fascinating that the Talmud uses as one of the excuses for the solar eclipse, one of the reasons that the Talmud gives for the solar eclipse, is the young woman that's raped and no one does anything about it. No one comes to her aid, which to me is almost poetic in its timing. But above that, yes, look what's happening. The sun is making a little is getting fixed. The sun is getting a little bit of, like the Talmud calls it, beating. The sun is getting a little beating, and the sun and the moon are right now, at least they're going to be lined up, at least for a moment, which also I think can give us a glimpse into the fact that although it seems that we cannot get out of situations that are imperfect, there will be a time where things will be corrected. And of course, the job of us as a Jewish people and as human beings is to create that light and to create that symmetry and that perfection within our daily lives, and not to become despondent when we see that it's broken, because that's the nature of this universe. The nature of this universe is predicated on a little bit of brokenness. And and when something is a little broken, what happens is that humility can set in. If something is perfect, it's beyond repair, and also means that there's nothing left for us to do if everything is perfect. So it also means that we have work to do, the inner work that we have to do for ourselves, and the outer work that we have to do in the world. And we'll look at this phenomenon today as something that is unique, something that is fascinating, but it also shows you that things can change. That in a minute, something that is so powerful and seemingly not stoppable, like the sun, can be blocked by something that's 400 times smaller than it, just because everything is perfectly aligned. So it shows you that things can be corrected, and at the same time that there is imperfection in this universe, and that our job is to correct this universe, to do tikkun olam. And I found this to be very fascinating. I found the Maharal's explanation on the Talmud to be especially inspiring, because when we see that this is part of our life, often we get very frustrated. Well, why are things going wrong? When we see that this is how the universe has been predicated, that even the sun and the moon get mixed up sometimes, then we'll be easier on ourselves to say, so we've made mistakes, or we're going to make mistakes, or that we may be in a situation where we are recipients of mistakes and it's frustrating, or whatever it is. The idea of imperfection is something that we can live with, because that's the way God created the world itself. Even the sun, even the beautiful bright sun, it can get whipped sometimes, and that's what the Talmud calls it, a whipping. And so I think it could be a source for us of hope, perhaps, and also for to know that we could continue on, and that ultimately there will be a time where the great masculine energy and the great feminine energy are going to be lined up, and more than lined up. As we said, that it says that the feminine energy will be ascendant and rising, and it will be even greater than the masculine energy. And when we talk about those energies, we're really talking about the fact that it's more than male female. We're talking about the fact that the feminine attributes are something that the world still does not yet recognize as great. So even women who have accomplished themselves in terms of doing what was traditionally in a man's world, having success in that realm, they're still doing masculine things. They're being competitive. They're having an edge. They're very powerful. They may be calling the shots. And those are great things for women to have, because there has been an imbalance for women, but it still doesn't edify the feminine. The feminine is the reticent, the quiet, the nurturing, the giver, the receiver, this energy that our world still does not yet recognize as superior, or at least equal to that of the masculine. And so the day that will happen, that feminine energy, that nurturing and self-effacing and kind energy that is reflected in the feminine, when that will be something that the world will appreciate as much as they appreciate masculine energy, there will be the perfect alignment. And until then, what we have is a little eclipse that kind of gives us a purview to the fact that it could happen, that even though this seems to be a blimp of nature, it could happen. And hopefully we should have that alignment very soon, and that the terrible things that we do see happening in our world should be rectified. And we do not make a blessing for that, someone who asked me, because the rabbis say that the rabbis in the Talmud, they don't have a word for eclipse. They call it hit, loke. The sun is hit, or the moon is hit. So it happens to be right now that the moon is the one doing the hitting, and the moon is associated with the Jewish people, so that it's not necessarily a negative idea for the Jewish people, but still the fact that it gets dark in the middle of the day should give us pause. And because of that, there's no blessing associated with it. We do not make a blessing on the eclipse, but it's definitely something that we can take to heart. And certainly by talking about it and not just letting it slide by, I thought that what are the chances that on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, right after we read the mitzvah of the first moon, on a few hours away from Rosh Chodesh Nisan, that we're going to have this phenomenon that we can talk about, that is actually going to be something that we're going to experience on some level, whether directly or indirectly, and that it comes at the same time that the Torah portion of Tazria, which talks about the entire idea of lack, that there's an imbalance. And I saw something from Rabbi Steinsaltz, if we have time to share it. Rabbi Steinsaltz says that he sees this as a phenomenon. He sees the relation between Tuma and Tara as, the analogy that he gives is what he calls the production of a magnetic field that happens when a drastic change occurs in an electrical field. And one of the ways it happens, he says, is when an electrical current that is moving through metal suddenly stops, in which case magnetization occurs, and he says the new phenomenon is produced at the point of change, whether it's an extreme change or a limited change. And what he's saying essentially is that in the Torah portion of Tazria, what we have is this kind of abrupt stopping of a flow of energy, of spiritual energy that requires someone to later go to the temple. So for the Mitzorah, it's a blocking of physical energy that is, I guess, in the health realm. Same for the Zav. And for the woman who gives birth, it's this child that leaves her, and there's a vacuum. And I saw that one of the reasons that they say that there's a vacuum is because there's so much life that is invested. And God himself, it says that God does not present himself in nature only in three things. And one of them is making rain, and the other is by childbirth, that God himself is invested in childbirth. So when he leaves, there is this lack. I thought it was very poetic for Rabbi Steinsaltz to call it like this magnetic, this kind of magnetic change. And that is really what he sees as Tuma and Tara, which is what the whole Tazria and Mitzorah is about, which is these statuses in Jewish life that, by all accounts, are not really something that we can touch or feel. They're somewhat ethereal. And what does it mean? What does it mean to have Tuma and Tahara? We don't really understand it. And he explains it as this kind of a change in the energy. And that's really what the solar eclipse is about. There's a shift where the moon is going to block the sun. And it's just momentary, but it does create darkness. And that's what Tuma is. Tuma is a momentary lapse of vitality or transparency, and it creates a certain darkness that the person has to go to the mikveh and has to change their status. And this whole idea of Tuma and Tara is so complex that Maimonides says it's the most complex part of the Torah. It's the most difficult to understand. Solomon said, I understand everything. Give me anything. And I really understand it. He was so wise, but he said, when it comes to this notion of this blockages, that the spiritual blockages that happen between Tuma and Tara, which is what Torah portion of Tazria is all about, I don't understand it. And that's because it's a little bit ethereal. It's not so tangible. We can't really feel it. So then we're given an example of what this looks like, maybe spiritually, which is a solar eclipse. There's a blockage for a moment, and that gives us an idea of what Tuma is in this world, that there is a blockage of spirituality for a moment, and that blockage changes the status of the person. So for a woman who gives birth, it's a blockage it's a blockage from not having the baby within her anymore. And for a Mitzorah, it's a blockage because they have leprosy, which doesn't allow them to have full vitality. And the same is true for the Zav. So this is a very fascinating intersection between seeing a blockage in the sky and reading about a blockage in the Torah and having it happen at the same time, which what eclipse is. Eclipse is this kind of a coincidental, not so coincidental, but this coincidental coming together of all things at the same time. And I thought we had a perfect eclipse between the Torah portion of Tazria, the eclipse, and the reading of Hachodesh that we read this Shabbat. So I thought I would share that with you. I hope that was inspiring and interesting. And there are more commentaries, but the basic commentaries on the eclipse will be found from the Maharal. And again, because it was very long and in Hebrew, the Maharal is very he's very expressive in his commentary. He's not succinct, so he'll say something in many paragraphs. He's flowing in his language, and so it would have taken too long to go through all of it, but it was very fascinating to study and to see that the gist of what the Maharal is saying is that essentially that there is this blockage that exists in the universe, and that's the source of all negativity. And that's that we could say that was God set us up that way, that even the way the moon is diminished was part of the divine plan. And our job is to bring light into this world. And when we have a blockage, we have a we have a prescription in the Torah portion, which is you wait 7 days, you go to the mikveh, meaning a blockage doesn't end you. It doesn't have to destroy you. And the same is true for this eclipse. We go through it, we understand that there's something that happened here, which there's a interesting coincidence where light is blocked, and then we go further. So I think it's a good metaphor for tuma in our life. And we Jews are very sensitive to this. For example, we know that we go to a funeral, a Jewish funeral, there is the washing station after the funeral, and we wash our hands. What are we doing when we wash our hands? We haven't touched anything. What is the idea of washing the hands? It doesn't seem to make any sense. It's because we're recognizing that there was some type of eclipse. There was a blockage, a life left the body. There was a lack of vitality, and us being in that presence of that have been affected spiritually on some level. So the washing of the hands is this kind of recognition of that blockage. And we are very sensitive to the idea of blockage and to the sense of a spiritual blockage. So that's that. And in the meantime,
wow, very interesting. What an interesting
I found it to be very fascinating. When I saw there was a coming, I said, what does the Torah say about the eclipse? I have to find this out. And then I was diving, and then I was like, wow, this is such, and then I'm like looking at Tazria, I'm like, oh, there's Tazria, blockage, Hachodesh, new moon. It's all coming together.
Eclipse,
and that, this is what we call living with the times. The first Rebbe of Chabad said that a Jew has to live with the times, and he says it's not the times of the year, but it's to live with the see how the times are reflected in the Torah study that we take at any given time, and if it's a source of comfort or inspiration or at least elucidation, and to understand that the rabbis were talking about this and wondering about this as well, and that it's a conversation that was begun long before us and will probably continue long after us. So fascinating.
Devorah, yeah. Could that married woman who was raped in my Torah class on Saturday in Shabbat, our teacher said it symbolizes Israel herself. She, like you were saying,
it's not married. It says Rusa. She's betrothed.
Yeah.
So Arusa, yeah. So it says that the Jewish people are betrothed to God. I think it's a great euphemism. I think it's a great euphemism for what's happening in the world. But you know what? It's not the first time, and it won't be the last time. I remember as a child, and I'll conclude with this. I remember as a child reading about, medieval Jewish history, a child, a young teenager, and being so flummoxed and so perplexed about the notion of a blood libel. And I remember thinking, but how could anyone believe a blood libel? That's ridiculous. Like, Jews throw out an egg if it has a blood spot in it. We soak our meat and we rinse it and we try to get rid of all the blood that we can. We have such an injunction against consuming blood. How does any reasonable person understand? I just didn't understand. I remember asking my parents, like, why would people believe such nonsense? And they said people were uneducated at the time. And then you see that, the blood libel continues. Yesterday, there was a demonstration in front of Westmount Square and against Israel. And one of the signs said that Israel killed 1,200 Jews on October 7th, that they were the ones who created the October 7th massacre in order to create war with Gaza. And that it's all a hoax, that they did it. It's Israel. Israel went in and murdered and killed and raped their children and babies and burnt their houses down so they could have a pretext for a war with Gaza. And you're thinking, like, in which world does anyone believe this?
I'll tell you.
This is so outlandish, but you see, the imagination can run wild, and also if there's no moral imperative to be honest with yourself, then you could go wherever you want. You could say whatever you want. There's no moral imperative. So you could say whatever you want. And for the first time in my life, really for the first time in my life, I now understand how a blood libel was a reality for Jews for 1,000 years in Europe. Literally from the year 1000 till the year 1901. I think the last blood libel was in Europe, or maybe I know there was one in Messina, New York, I think in 1903, but I think 1905, then the Mendel Bayless trial was a blood libel, and that was a little later. But yeah, and so we have this. The Jewish people are that we're betrothed to God, not yet married to Him somehow. Somehow we haven't made it to the stage where we're protected, and yet we don't let go. So I think it's very comforting for me when I saw the teaching of the Maharal. I found it particularly comforting because
today in the news. Oh, sorry.
Yes,
today in the news. I was listening to the radio in the car. It was saying that Nicaragua has lodged a complaint to the International Court of Justice, saying that Germany is sending arms to Israel, and therefore Germany must be convicted of genocide.
Yes, but once you've already established that what Israel is doing is genocide, when all the numbers don't bear out anything that's said, but you could say whatever you want, like a blood libel. You could say that the child is being drunk for its blood, and you're taking out the blood. Then there's nowhere. Then of course, then every Jew is every Jew that supports.
I see that so much in tune with this eclipse of today. Germany, who eclipsed us, is now giving us light.
Yes, Hashem,
Germany.
God works, and this is definitely the mystery of the universe, and so strange how the world works, so that we can never box anything for too long into anything. But I think for me, it's a source of comfort. It means that God created the world with imperfections, and our job is to bring that perfection to this world. And if we're not successful all the time, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, because ultimately we are shown also that little moon can show up to the sun and block the sun itself. So it's a glimpse to a time when feminine energy, which is the receiving energy, which is the less aggressive energy, is going to be stronger than even the masculine energy, and that is also part of the story. And so that's like, it's at the same time, God created the world where, yes, the masculine energy wins. Fame, fortune, power is the language of today. And even for women, getting up there, it's not like because you had so much patience with someone who needed to hear you, or because you sat and explained something to a young person with patience and no one heard you, and you never made it to Instagram. you never had a story about it. No one is going to give you credit for it. That's where it's really at, and that's what's really not valued in terms of what makes the world go round. But ultimately, the world, even this world, is going to recognize that, and we're going to go towards it. I think we're going towards it. So I found the Maharal's explanation very inspiring for myself. So I wanted to share that with you. I want to wish everyone easy preparations. Now tonight is happy Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Rosh Chodesh Nisan is a month that we always associate with miracles because of Passover miracles, and it's also associated with women working really hard and getting into the kitchen and koshering everything, and please God, that we should have the blessings of a revealed world of good in our world, and to understand that there's that even God Himself, wrote this into our story, but that He also wrote the end of the story. So we hold on. Do we say a prayer tonight? I think that we don't have to say a prayer. I think we could just marvel at it and take to heart that yes, sometimes the little moon could block the sun, and that also the world is not perfect, and that's okay. God created it that way. So I wish everyone a blessed week and easy preparations for Passover, wherever they may take you. And we should go from strength to strength and look to the Torah for wisdom and for inspiration. And I found it fascinating that the rabbis talked about everything. They talked about eclipses. Who knew? It's really beautiful.
Thanks for bringing it to us.
Sure. My pleasure.
Thank you very much. Very great.
Have a blessed week, everyone. Take care.